The way I reach out to investors is typically I find a connection, and that might be they've invested with me before and we've had some success, or sometimes we've had failures, but they've seen how we worked hard to try to make it a success. Friends and family, and then a lot of the current investors can also be good sources for finding new investors. And I think across those three fronts, you find your best practice. I personally like to find a connection with the investors and the prospective investors. And what I mean by that is they can add value to the business in some way. They have relationships, or their network can somehow create value for the business. Another way is that they have some kind of emotional connection. They like your product, they've had some experience in their family where they could have used your product, or they just personally, it appeals to them. So I think across those fronts, you kind of have the starting point for attracting investors. So finding the right investors for your business, I think starts with getting to know them. So you want to have a relationship with your investors and add value. I mean, most checks are good checks, but you want to avoid the bad checks where somebody has misaligned expectations. And I think it's your job as the leader of the company when you're courting investors to make sure that you have alignment. Because you're going to go through some highs together and you're going to go through some lows together. And you want to make sure that those investors can weather the storm with you through the lows without upsetting the apple cart, so to speak. So I think it's important that you get to know them and that they understand and get to know you and how you operate and what the goals and objectives are clearly aligned for the company to be successful. That's a very important part of the process of getting investors in early stage businesses is they need to regularly communicate with your investors about how the business is doing. What works best, I find, is a quarterly report that is typically 3 to 5 pages, and it sums up the good, the bad, and the ugly with what's going on in the business. I find it's also very helpful for me to stay organized in leading the business so that it provides kind of this built-in accountability that I know I need to crank out a quarterly report to the investors. And then that kind of trickles down through the organization because they know, hey, towards the end, as soon as the quarter ends, we're going to have to put together this report that tells investors how we're tracking. Part of investing is emotional, and your investors want to know what's going on. I find that by clearly communicating with investors where things stand, oftentimes, not only does it help us to be more organized in how we run the business, it also allows investors to add value where they say, oh, I see that this is going on. I have a couple contacts that may be able to help you with that, or, so it tends to be very positive and very freeing and helpful to the business if you can regularly communicate with your investors. What works typically good for investors are graphs and bar charts, so that you can kind of see regular progress and how things are scaling or growing. I always like the Ben Franklin methodology. What are the positives and the negatives? And that's usually how we started out. What went good this quarter? What didn't go so good this quarter? And then you kind of get into the detail on where you're at with your product or service. What are the financials behind that? Some investors will never look at it. Others will just look at the bar charts and the graphs and spend 3 or 4 minutes going through it, and others will read every dot and tittle in there all the way from beginning to end, and they'll give you comments on it. And I like to sum it up at the end with, here are our goals for the year, and here's how we are tracking year to date on our goals for the year. I think that's always a good way to kind of close it out. So those are the basic things that I think work best to have in that report. So I think the relationship that you have as a leader of the business with your investors is obviously very important. I like to host, have them come in, try out your product or service. If you have something that they or their family can use, that's always a good way to kind of get them in the boat with you and maintain that relationship. If your product or service is something that they cannot use, then I think the quarterly report or just some type of, annual meeting or periodic meeting with them is always good. And of course, some of them, they're busy people too, and they don't necessarily want to take up a lot of your time. So I think it's all kind of relative, and you have to gauge that. But at the end of the day, you know, they've entrusted you with their money. And I like a story that one of my investors said is, "Ray, these are my soldiers. Please deploy them appropriately," right? And so there's some type of responsibility you clearly have when you're accepting other people's money. And one of the things that I despise in life is losing money for anybody. And so if you take that fiscal responsibility and you understand that they have worked hard to create their soldiers, so to speak, you know, you have that responsibility to deploy them. And that regular communication, I think, is one way to make sure you're in sync with them.